this sounds to me like you get most of your fantasy from the game in your head anyway, right?
Yes.
So I would say like you're more of a theater of the mind. You embrace more of theater of the mind than battle maps as far as getting the fantasy you want out of
As
events.
far
Is
as the
that fair?
fantasy, but I do appreciate the clarity of the board.
Sure.
Hello, friends. Robert Bevan here, author of the Caverns Creatures series of comedy, fantasy novels, and short stories. With me is Sam West, and today we're going to be talking about. You know what, Sam? Why don't you walk us in? This was your idea, and you wrote the article. Introduce
Sure.
this for us.
Okay, the gist of it is there's two main ways people play this game, and this has been a kind of, I don't want to say hot topic, but it gets talked about a decent amount online. It's should you play with a battle map or should you play in theater of the mind? Which has more value, which is more immersive, what are the pros, cons of each? I'm a big proponent of using both for different things. So we're gonna dive into like why you would use one or the other, who they're for, where they're good at in encounter design and where they're like, not so great at. I
All
think
right.
there's some opportunity for it.
Well, help me out here because I mean I've always used battle maps through my entire
Oh,
D&D career. Um, whether I mean not whether sometimes it was graph paper, sometimes we got fancy and made our own maps with a whiteboard and a permanent marker graph. And but yeah, the I mean I always considered it also theater of the mind. So what are your definitions here?
So the basic definitions is theater of the mind has no physical representation at all of where
Mhm.
anyone is, where any objects are, where any monsters are. That is a theater of the mind encounter. And I'm just saying this specifically in the context of running initiatives. So events need to be happening in time sequence. Whenever you are in town negotiating with, a random shopkeeper, there might not be a battle map for that encounter. I don't consider that encounter a theater of the mind encounter for this term, but it is happening
Mhm.
within theater of the mind in the same fashion. It would be
Right.
just that kind of event, but in a combat state where you need to care about where things are in space without having the physical manifestations there. Battle maps then encompass everything else. If you are using miniatures, graph paper, markers, whiteboards, all of that is encompassing battle maps. It can get
Yeah.
very, very detailed. It can also be very loose. So, the flexibility is a big selling point to it. This includes online battle maps, right? Like if you have
Right. Sure.
digital representations of tokens and creatures and stuff like that. Comprehensive
Okay.
definitions.
Sure.
So,
Ah, yeah, but as someone who hasn't played, uh, I guess, pure theater of the mind, what is that? I can't even think of what that looks like. All right, you're sitting around a table. There's no map, no nothing. The fight's happening. All right, I attack the bugbear, and okay, we still roll dice. Yes.
mhm.
Okay.
The dice, the character sheets, those are all still there.
All right.
Just
So
the physical board is missing, basically.
there's there's five bugbears. I killed one. Like, how are we keeping track of this?
Uh, good description. So
Okay.
one of my first campaigns I ever got to play in was way back in high school, and Theater of the Mind was a necessity because we wanted to play on places like the bus. We wanted to play whenever we had downtime between band and whatever, right? So as opposed to having to drag around whiteboards, with as opposed to having to drag around pencil paper pull out, we would just you can't draw all that easily on a bumping ride whenever there's four seats separating the eight of us. We would just use theater of the mind, and that led to our DM getting really good at describing things. And you get a feel for smaller scope sized encounters, and by the natural fit of encounters shrunk a lot to make it really digestible and easy to understand where what is, who is where, what is going on in these environments. You give your DM a little bit more room to describe things. You give your DM a little bit more room to say, this is the environment. Questions are sort of posed, and everyone is required to be a little bit more engaged in what's being said than they are in, uh, when they have a physical representation on a battle map, just because you don't want to waste people's time by saying, "Oh no, where was that thing again?" If you were paying attention, there's a higher chance that you can remember where the descriptions of the things are, and the battle goes from there. This also leads a lot to well-described monsters that are different from each other. So in a battle map, you'll see these six goblins, and often they'll go void of description because I attack that goblin. In
Yeah.
Theater of the Mind, a lot of time is there's a goblin with a large scar across his face. There's a goblin with twisted black hair is tied up in a large bun with two bones going through it. There's a goblin that's taller than the rest and is missing an arm. And they all are the same goblin stat block, but that description gives you a clearer indication of who you're attacking, and it honestly adds a lot of functionality and flavor to it. You can do that with battle maps too, of course. It just isn't as needed or as useful in battle
Right.
maps. It adds more to the thematics of it, where Theater of the Mind kind of necessitates a little bit more clear descriptor like that to reduce confusion and make encounters run smoother.
Yeah, it could be fun to play battle maps with a DM that has been primarily running Theater of the Mind for that reason.
Yeah, because I started out running Theater of the Mind, I feel I am sometimes too verbose, and I'm sure if you've watched any of these videos, commoners, you may agree. It is a useful tool, and I think it definitely encapsulates more of a world. You get more of a feeling of variety of monster. You feel a little bit less like the gaminess of it, and feel a little bit more like the story element of it. I like that. I think it's a big perk too.
Yeah, nice.
I think it's a big perk of Theater of the Mind that is often undersold.
Let me ask you this, and stop me if this is the sort of thing we're going to cover later in the video. I've only had time to skim the article. I haven't
Sure.
posted it yet. It'll be posted by the time this goes live. Um, how does stuff like range work? Like all right, I've got a spell that's 60 feet. Uh, am I? I'm keeping track of, or I'm keeping track. The DM's keeping track of how far each of these monsters are from me. Everybody's moving. That seems complicated without physical representation.
Visual representation is very helpful for reducing that confusion, yes. What I found normally occurs is the ranges become increments of speed as opposed to increments of actual feet, and that whenever I'm planning encounters, and I do this with battle maps too, to be honest, I care more about how many times it takes a character to move to get within range of something, and those larger like areas are easier to like think about mechanically. It's harder to conceptualize for me exactly 20 feet. It's easier
Right.
for me to conceptualize my character isn't within attack range, but they are within my move range. And that gives a lot more wiggle room. So whenever you're doing these kinds of descriptors, whenever you're running Theater of the Minds, you're often giving dimensions for rooms and things like that. You're often giving this creature is this far away from you. Small, close encounters remove a lot of this problem because things will jam up against each other immediately, and then everything is close to or in melee range. And then the wizard in the back of the room's only 30 feet. Everything's in range. There isn't any issue about range once you get to the smaller, tighter quarters. In larger, wider scopes, it gets very, very messy, though. If you're
Yeah.
trying to run a big, epic Lord of the Rings style war scene, it is hard to conceptualize just how far away the 400-foot wizard is as everyone's moving around a very complicated environment.
Or even just like 8 goblins out in the wilderness and you want to cast a fireball. How do I know how many I can get within in the area? Is you just make it up? Or...
Normally, again, your DM normally has an idea of where things start, and everyone gets that spot, and that's sort of like a click picture in time that's trying to be collected in everyone's brains. And you'll be like, the goblins are within 40 feet of each other in these different spots, and then the player can go, okay, great. How many can I hit? And the DM will tell them 5, and then they hit 5.
Yeah. All right.
It can be a lot more streamlined. It can also be a lot more complicated. If you're the kind of person that wants exact numbers and wants to feel the game at a numerical level, Theater of the Mind can be a really, really big hassle because it is a lot of tracking and it's a lot of mental tracking, which can be taxing. It can be frustrating, especially if your DM just goes, oh no, you're within walking distance, or you're within whatever. And you go, well, no, he was 45 feet away. I know that because that's the range you told me he was. That is a real thing that happens a lot in Theater of the Mind.
Well, that is, and also, I'm a big fan of force movement effects. So, those 5-foot shoves, might not be as meaningful if we're not working with exact numbers.
No, they'll be exactly as meaningful. Exactly. Because they're already not meaningful on regular battle maps unless they're going into spike growths. And if they're going into spike growths, that's exactly the same Theater of the Mind, right? Like exactly the same. You're next to the spike growth,
Yeah.
that's where the 5-foot shove matters.
Okay.
I think small movements like that, normally the reality of it is they move out of my physical range and into the space next to me. And that just is going to be where stuff's set up. I don't think it's honestly that much more to track than it is on a battle map. But your mileage may vary.
All right. Well, with that out of the way, let's dive into. I guess we'll go through the article as you have it written.
Sure. So I have it broken down into a couple categories that you can kind of compare as to where the juice is worth the squeeze for doing these different kinds of encounters, where I find there are pros and cons. The first one that you can talk about is cost. Theater of the Mind is literally free. So that's always great, but so are a lot of battle maps, is the reality of it. In the digital age, especially if you're playing online, it's not hard to find free resources that make battle maps really accessible to everyone using them. Now, there are different costs. So like your Roll20 subscription or your D&D Beyond subscription or buying Foundry or whatever the platform it is you're using. If you're using a paid platform, that's cost. The cost of, you know,
The
internet and
whiteboard
all
and
that other
permanent marker. Oh, all
abstractness that you're
right.
going to have anyway. But they're also like, you might want to consider supporting artists. And doing that is, if I use a lot of this person's battle maps, they usually have Patreons, and you'll want to support that to some degree. If you want to make your own battle maps, if you don't want to use pre-made ones, which you could do. I don't ever. I normally just plunder Reddit for whatever the coolest map is and be like, oh, that's sweet. I'm going to make this cool event happen here based off of this idea this other person had. But if you want to make all your own stuff, that software can cost money. And there are free versions out there, but that more time. There's a lot of little hiccups there. We'll get on tie and prep later, but
And some people even play on tables.
it's true.
And
And
I like I said, I used to make my own maps. Just a big whiteboard, get at Walmart for like $10 or something, and a permanent marker and straight
inflation.
edge.
I got mine for 25.
Whew. Yeah, but I used to make my own little graph on there, and then, but yeah, that it's as pricey as you want it to be. I
Yeah.
mean, you can do this with graph paper and little pins or something to represent your characters. Use coins to represent characters, whatever.
Yeah.
When I had the whiteboard, it was magnetic, so we just represented with little circular magnets of different colors, and that's fine. But
How
yeah, some people what?
Oh, literally how I always do it with whiteboards is just the first letter of the character's name. That's their representation on the whiteboard.
Oh,
And I just physically draw them all over the thing.
I'm the green circle. Yeah, but back before I got fancy with the whiteboard, it was just on the table, and we'd construct our own little characters out of my vast collection of Lego minifigures.
Legos are
And
classics.
yes, but but yes, they have real miniatures that some people really like. That's a part of the game for them. They a part of the culture. They like collecting them. They like painting them. I never have, but that's a thing I appreciate that people enjoy.
Yeah, that
Also,
actually
like,
I think will translate really well into personalization. So I have this section too that talks about that real perk that battle maps have is you're encouraged to have representations of your character, and that is going to give more people the ability to go shopping. And while that might sound dumb, it is genuinely a fun experience to get the right dice set for your character, go on Hero Forge and make exactly the character you want to look like.
mm,
From the DM's perspective, this gets even more exacerbated because you can physically assemble huge mounds of terrain. There are long documentaries about people that have been playing 20-year D&D campaigns from AD&D or whatever, and
mm,
the basement is just there's terrain all along the walls. There's a huge table in the center that's got a massive city currently spread up on it that changes all the time. Thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars are poured into, and hundreds and hundreds of hours painting, assembling, doing all of the exact details for it. It can expand the hobby to even a different fun location, right? It can be they're like not quite the same, but they are tangential hobbies that intersect and weave together, both mini painting and the assembly of all that stuff. It's a really great way to represent yourself and express yourself in some cool artistic ways. That's a really big perk the battle maps will always have over Theater of the Mind. Theater of the Mind also then offers some amount of personalization in terms of people that like to talk. If you like to be the person that narrates, if you want to be more of a storyteller and you want to go really in depth on you could even consider it like the improv style of it. If you're like a theater kid that really wants to lean in, Theater of the Mind is a little bit more what it can offer you more opportunities to do the heroic stuff because you're not necessarily stapled to a map. Your personalization of, I want to look exactly this way, is a little bit more free to do that without the constraints of a board and a grid and all of the other things. So there is a little bit of personalization on both ends. I think the battle map takes the cake as far as like more people will want to engage in that side of the hobby, but there are plenty of people that will enjoy the Theater of the Mind opportunities that arise that feel a little bit more restricted by a battle map, I think.
that's why I like just the little plain single colored circular magnets, because no figure or Lego character was ever going to match exactly what I had in my mind. So,
That's
all right, that's the representation. The rest of it is right here.
sure.
But
That I think is one of the
going back to what you were saying about the basement full of all this terrain and stuff. Yeah, that's one way this can get expensive. There are other ways. I wanted to bring up a pretty cool setup. I saw a guy who lives not far away from me had up.
Mhm.
It's like a a hybrid of physical and digital. He had
Oh, these are sweet. Yeah.
the tabletop and then a projector from the ceiling
Mhm.
hooked up to his computer, and he could just put the map down on the table and switch it out for another one instantly. That
There's
was really
also
cool.
giant TV or giant like gaming tables that are built these days. Like Wormwood
Oh
Gaming is
yeah.
one of the companies that produces them, and you can get like LED screens and just giant TV monitors and stuff in there that you just have access to. That you just throw up the digital map, and the players can put all the stuff right on top of it and engage with it that way.
Mhm.
Even outside of like the physical presentation of the map itself, the gaming space is also part of it, but gaming space I think is more. That's a little bit leaving the scope of it. As far as the battle map expenses go, $1,000 or $2,000, like really well put together screen inside of a giant table, that's an expense. You're absolutely
Oh yeah.
right. And it sure drives up the price of battle maps a lot. So,
Yeah.
I
Like I
think
said, expensive as you want it to be.
exactly. And that's a really big perk to battle maps, I think, where Theater of the Mind is kind of just always free. So you don't really have
Yeah.
that many opportunities to invest in it, which, that's a bummer for some people. Moving on, we can get into we sort of touched on personalization, touched on cost. Preparation is an interesting topic as to what takes more time to prep a battle map encounter or a Theater of the Mind encounter.
This
And
feels
like,
like it's going to depend on whether it's somebody like you or somebody like me.
true. So like as we've noticed, am again very verbose. I also love improv. I love the seat of your pants D&D, coming up with things on the fly. And you
That terrifies me.
when you practice a lot and you do it a lot, you start to make better and better encounters, and Theater of the Mind lends itself really, really well to that. The reason I moved to whiteboards is because they are really convenient to translate what's coming in my brain to a better representation of space that players can like quickly identify faster. They can it removes some of the slowness to encounter, some of the me having to explain these are the exact dimensions of the room. This is exactly where X, Y, or Z is. I can use representation of space to sort of expedite that process. Still, Theater of the Mind encounters as like a spurred improv thing that isn't going to work for everyone, and it's not always going to lead to good encounters. So like while I say I like to improv a lot, improvisation is not a full replacement a lot of the time for prep, and I think campaigns suffer because people assume they're like I do this too much. I assume I'm good enough at improv that I don't need to do any prep work, when prep work will genuinely make a more engaging experience for me and my players. So
Mm.
you want to prep Theater of the Mind encounters even if you don't intend to run on a battle map. How you prep them is different than how you prep battle map encounters. And that is hard to exactly articulate, but it involves a lot more of listing descriptors. It involves larger pages of notes. You actually will have to like, what is in this space that I want my players to engage with? How do I get that information to them? And how am I denoting the different things in space? And that's a lot of work. Whereas on a battle map, you could shorten that process by just saying, these are the 6 goblin figures that I have, slam them on the table. I don't need to care about what any of them look like. I just know there's going to be 6 goblins here. I don't even need to care necessarily about where exactly they're going to go. I can just put them on the map as I set it up, and
Mhm.
that will take away most of the legwork there. The encounter build becomes more about finding the map. It becomes more about coming up with the space, and that can be less time intensive.
Now you're talking exclusively for game masters, not so much for players right now.
Oh yeah, this is entirely in the wheelhouse of
Yeah.
game masters. The players don't have to prep at all differently for either of
Yeah.
these, I don't think. Right? Like you're not changing how you prepare your rogue if you're going into a room, whether it's on a battle map or in your brain. I don't
No.
think. Yeah. This all also does expand out though. So like while Theater of the Mind, I think at the very lowest level requires slightly more prep for the very in-depth encounters. The moment you start tying in any of those big expensive things we started talking about, oh boy, does prep become a very, very, very challenging thing for a battle map person to do, right? If you want the big sprawling gaming table, you better be willing to commit weekends to making that table look the way that you want it to. You better
Yeah.
be ready to commit large amounts of time painting and assembling minis. Again, that's part of the hobby for people. That's some of the enjoyment of the game. But that undoubtedly is a lot more prep time, right? That's undoubtedly a lot more effort than it
Absolutely. Yeah.
is to scroll down some notes over an hour thinking about how an encounter is going to go.
All right. Where are we going from here?
But we got there's one easy area to talk about too, clarity. And then we have one other topic we can talk about after that, which is the fantasy of it, which one takes you into the fantasy more.
Mm.
Clarity is the easier one to talk about just because battle maps are like abundantly more clear than Theater of the Mind is, and I think that's probably the largest selling point for battle maps. And again, it's why I use a battle map most of the time now. I will use Theater of the Mind encounters whenever they're very, very small, but whenever I'm doing any kind of big set piece that I want to like have showcase a couple of new monsters or whatever. I ran some Hound Archons and some Lantern Archons, and I wanted to have like rotating platforms where the Lanterns were turrets, the Hound Archons were teleporting all over the place. There was no world I was running that only in the brain. I wanted to have a very detailed, large map that has a lot of these moving parts detailed. It makes clarity so much easier. And you do lose some things in that clarity, in that the detailed descriptors go down, and when detailed descriptors go down, some people lose some of the fantasy of it, which I will touch on in a second. But undoubtedly, if you are a person that is concerned about how clear your encounters are, if you're not confident in your ability to communicate information concisely while also remaining engaging, battle maps will help a lot as a tool to make it clear how the encounter is supposed to go, clear where everything is. Requires less of you as a DM, I think, once it's like in place. The players can make a lot of assumptions and figure a lot of stuff out by just looking at the environment as opposed to having to you needing to tell them. So,
yeah, going back to what I was saying, like, and it's not the only example. It's the one that keeps coming back to my head is the, force movement actions where, like, all right, if I can see enemies on a map, I know, all right, I need exactly 2 repelling blasts and a telekinetic to knock this guy off the cliff. Like, I like being able to know that.
sure. I always liked the question, how far is this person from X, or what is that person under X? And in Theater of the Mind, as a DM, I'm much more encouraged to say yes or give them, just a set number. And then what sort of happens is there was a vagueness that is left into the air whenever there's Theater of the Mind. There's a vagueness of exact locations that isn't necessarily, always a perk. But in the case of your example with repelling blasts, if I'm not thinking that you're going to try and shove them on the cliff, you can be like, how close are they to me? And how close is the cliff edge to me? And I give you those numbers and you go, oh, great. Okay, they're dead. I repel and blast them twice and they fly off the cliff. And I go,
Yeah.
I didn't think of that. And it's a really sweet moment for you, which is also a perk to Theater of the Mind in some ways. But you're right in that it's easier and clearer for you to say, oh, I can just do it right now. Bam, bam, off the cliff they go.
What about for like more 3-dimensional, like with a bunch of flying creatures? Because that's maybe difficult to do on a 2D map with,
Sure is.
gravity as it is.
The issue is also really, really hard to do in Theater of the Mind. This game is not great at showing 3D space, just because there are a lot of moving factors to 3D space. So, like, how you handle height, a lot of times we'll see on battle maps, again, the price starts to come out, you'll see the elevated levels, so you'll have
Right,
like a 20 feet up, mini goes on that, or 40 feet up, mini goes on that. That isn't that helpful, I find, just because you miss a lot of the encapsulation of it, right? That is all empty air. And in D&D, there can be more than empty air. In fact, it's a lot cooler whenever it's not just empty air. It's a lot cooler whenever there's floating objects, whenever there's falling objects, whenever there's interactive things, stalactites, stalagmites, crossing rope bridges and wire bridges in a complicated chasm, right? If you're in a ravine and there's a bunch of different mine tracks leading between the two different walls from an ancient or an old mine shaft abandoned, that's a really cool battle map. It
Sure.
is insanely difficult to write that on a whiteboard, to be like, this is at level 6. These are the different layers of all of that. And while Theater of the Mind, I think, can make small versions of that very much easier to represent, it can be quick and easy to say, okay, below you, there's a track running under about 20 feet underneath this bridge. There's a second one running perpendicular to it. Then you get an idea of, okay, that's where that is. This is where we are. This is the corridor. Everything else descriptor still works out. You don't need the detailed numbers on the map pointing to X, Y, or Z. The moment it expands any more than like 2 or 3 objects like that, it's still not great. Neither are good at this. So, yeah, I don't have a good answer to that question, even though I talked for about 2 minutes.
All right. Well, you know what? We found a gap in the market here. Somebody's gonna invent a way to make this simple. The world is your oyster.
No, they've been trying. Digital tabletops are doing their best for it.
Hmm.
They're not succeeding, I don't think, but I don't know.
Yeah.
So yeah, battle maps are a lot more clear, except in 3D space, when they're sometimes more clear, they're sometimes less clear, and it's still bad in both cases, I found a lot of the time. This leads to our last topic that I'm interested to hear your thoughts on, and that's like the fantasy of it all. So whenever you were talking about your green little dot, you said that it could be whatever you wanted in your brain. If that were a random miniature of, let's say you're playing a human rogue like you always do. If you had a random human rogue figure that takes you out of the fantasy, Like,
Oh,
if
no, I
that was
mean,
representation on a map, I mean.
I just feel like, why bother with the effort because it's still not meeting the fantasy.
So it's exactly
Yeah.
the same as like a piece of
Yes,
Lego, a piece of
exactly.
a penny or whatever.
Right.
I don't know if I entirely agree from a personal preference level. I have found that a little bit of fantasy goes a long way for me as far as representations go. So like my a buddy of mine picked up a intellect devour as his closet familiar because he couldn't find a closet, but it's close enough and it added a little bit of personality and flavor to it. And seeing that there instead of a little icon ties me more in to like his thought process whenever I'm looking at the map that my DM's using. So I do think, again, me personally, I find there is some value in specific minis, even if they don't perfectly one-to-one match the stated presentation, just because they attach me to that person and that person gave me their presentation of it, and all of that kind of works into my headcanon in a like cohesive, consistent way. But it's definitely going to vary person to person as to whether or not you feel more immersed in a theater of the mind event or you feel more immersed with the battle map utility, right? There are pros and cons to each.
I probably mentioned this before, but this was like the birth of Jorser the Sorcerer and how he became kind of the mascot of Authors of Dragons podcast. It's like, we're starting a new campaign and they said, all right, let's do all our characters, make them up on Hero Forge exactly like we want them. And I said, you know what? I don't have time for that. So I did a 5-minute doodle of a sorcerer he's Jorser the Sorcerer. Here he is. And so it was like, it mismatched everyone's detailed characters so well.
Beautiful.
Uh, and
He's a
but yeah,
mess.
to me, it was just as representative of my character as if I would have spent hours trying to create the perfect version on Hero Forge.
So that this sounds to me like you get most of your fantasy from the game in your head anyway, right?
Yes.
So I would say like you're more of a theater of the mind. You embrace more of theater of the mind than battle maps as far as getting the fantasy you want out of
As
events.
far
Is
as the
that fair?
fantasy, but I do appreciate the clarity of the board.
Sure. Um, that's fair. I think that's entirely reasonable. I know some people that are staunch in that the fantasy that they're going through is reduced by the encountering of physical game objects, right? Whenever you see that the mind flayer is represented by that commoner that you met 15 times ago in that one town because the DM doesn't have the right mini, that
Right.
pulls them out and makes them go, okay, we're in the game. I'm not really as engaged with this as I was prior because that's kind of dumb and silly, and this is a high stakes moment or whatever, right?
Yeah, that's not an issue at all for me. That mind flare is usually like this eraser.
Yeah, I kind of get that. I don't necessarily agree with it, and I think most fantasy for me, and I think you're this way as well, as you've said, it's about it's a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. I want the representations to be clear, and if they're unclear, it does definitely make me go, I don't know what's happening. What are we doing right now? What's supposed to be occurring? Any kind of disconnect there is obviously an issue, and battle maps can lend to that. Battle maps can have moments where you go, which of these 4 letters is me? There's like 4 subscripts under this, and that can pull you out of the moment. Where Theater of the Mind doesn't necessarily have the same issues, but I think both are fine.
Yeah.
I think if you go really, really immersive with your battle maps, like you spend the time and effort and energy and like price assembling giant set piece and scenes. I honestly don't love that as a personal preference, like the tile maps and stuff. I don't particularly find that useful just because I'm picturing it differently anyway, and I
I
don't
mean, I think your
necessarily engage
hobby
with it
goes
that much.
beyond. I think your hobby goes beyond D&D if you're doing that. Like that's like that's your hobby, and then the D&D playing is incidental. You
I
just
mean,
like to put together these elaborate set pieces.
again, that's why like I consider them parallel hobbies, right? Like
Yeah,
they intersect sometimes whenever you want
yeah.
to use the battle maps to certain things, but mini painting and like terrain assembly and stuff is its own whole little category of it. I just don't think battle maps are like that useful as an aid in immersing experience, but at the same time, they can be. It's messy, and your vibe is going to vary. And this is definitely the most vague of the terms. But this is all to say, if you're trying to figure out if you should do Theater of the Mind, if you should do Battle Maps, if you want to try one or the other, I think both of them have great uses for different means. I think Theater of the Mind is really great for short encounters that are unplanned in tight spaces. I think battle maps are really useful representations for more complex settings and spaces and ideas. If you're running larger groups, the larger the group, the more I want a battle map, generally speaking.
Yeah,
What you
I'll
prefer is
agree
up
with
to you,
that. Yeah.
obviously. What your needs are going to vary, and hopefully
Yeah, and
this.
I'm totally with you on the small encounters. They're like, all right, we don't need to put this on a map. Let's if we're gonna talk. If it comes to blows, let's roll some dice and
Yeah,
get it
there's a
over with.
counter, there's a barkeep,
Yeah,
there's 2 bouncers. We can figure this out. We don't need to
yeah.
pull up all the tools. So yeah, commenters down below. Let us know what you prefer, what you tend to use. If there are any you absolutely won't, will you only ever play Theater of the Mind? I'm just curious to hear. This has been a conversation been tossed around a little bit as to which is better. Again, I don't really think either is better. I think they're both useful tools for
No,
different things. I definitely would recommend trying out a variety of kinds of encounters and a variety of mediums to put those encounters on.
100% agree. All right, that was our discussion on battle maps and Theater of the Mind. Uh, Thank you, Sam, and thank you all for watching. Let us know what you think down in the comments below. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Bye bye.